As we began in review for last week's lesson began chapter 11. So the first 10 verses are by way of review. It deals with the conflicts between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and we've explained that in some detail. But Daniel was made ready to receive and made able to withstand the truth given by Gabriel by his empowering touch. You remember we found the weakness of Daniel as he faced the angel, and he was profoundly weak. And three times in chapter 10, verses 10, 16, and 18, we find Gabriel with the empowering touch to raise him up face to face, so that he was able to receive further information about that which had brought him down. It was so awesome that he couldn't hardly tolerate it. He even fainted under the weight of it. And he had to be restored. And so now restored, he is, after all, an older man, and he probably doesn't get up as fast as he used to when he was younger, as we all know how that works. And so Daniel, now in his old age, he was living under the Medes and the Persians, is given to understand that Xerxes, the fourth king yet to come, will, quotes, arouse his empire in order to attack Greece. We see that in verse 2 as we began that study. Daniel was already aware that the Grecian king Alexander would win over the greater force of the Persian army, as the goat, indeed, from the west destroyed the ram in the east. Daniel 8 explained that. But now Daniel must know why Alexander becomes a broken horn. Why does this great king fall? And so we come face to face in verses 3 and 4 with Alexander and his pride. This man thought he could just rule over anything. And God brought him down. And he brought him down, as it were, a very young man. Early 30s, he was dead. We know that in the worldly scene, it seems that alcohol was a good cause for that, but we do not know for sure all the machinations of the prophecies of God, except to know that God is managing the life, not only in the beginning, but in the end, of every individual on the face of the earth. And Alexander and his pride did fall. And so now Greece, without a great king, found its destiny in the hands of four of Alexander's generals, two of which, the Seleucids of Assyria and the Ptolemies of Egypt, would, over the years following, war against one another, passing to and fro through Israel. And that's the lesson of chapter 11. Daniel is going to come to understand how infinite is God's revelation in many of his prophecies. This particular prophecy of chapter 11 has more detail in it than any other prophecy ever given. And we should understand there's something special about that. We get bored with, this king, that king, and so on. But we need to understand something special is going on here. There are lessons to be learned in the middle of this. Ptolemy I led by a strong commander, it says in verse 5, became a great sovereign authority, as the Greeks under Ptolemy I are first identified here. And they, under Ptolemy II, attempted to make a peaceful arrangement with Antiochus II in the north, that is in Syria, by a marriage contract. And that got off on the wrong footing, as the wife of Antiochus killed him and his new bride, as we read in verse 6. A broken treaty means war and a change of kings. It's almost always that you have some form of security when you make a treaty with another country. And in that day and age, it was giving of your own flesh and blood to some other king so that you could seal an agreement that wouldn't be broken. Well, it didn't work out well. Not in this case. So, in retaliation, Ptolemy III came to wage war against the new king of the north, called Seleucus II, returning to Egypt with spoils of war, verses 7 and 8. Some years would pass, it says in verse 8, before an unsuccessful attempt by the king of the north, now Seleucus II, to counter and to enter the realm of the king of the south, verse 9. A second son of Antiochus II, named Antiochus III, was able to defeat Ptolemy IV, we read in verse 10. Now, that's just for quick reminders, not to go back and repeat how all that happened. And then as we begin today, we begin in verse 11. And the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given unto the hand of the former. Now, can you, in your English language, understand that quickly? I doubt it. We are dated at 217 BC. That's where we're at in time now. And in this particular year, the Egyptians defeated the Syrians at Rapha, which is in Gaza. Does that bring forth a little thought? You've never heard of those kind of places, have you? Well, anyway, but Antiochus III gathered a larger army to counter the Egyptians. But that multitude will be given unto the hand of the former. In other words, even though the initial attacks by Antiochus III failed, the Egyptians overpowered them. It doesn't quit there. So in verse 12 we read, when the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. Boy, when I first read that, I just go, what are we talking about? Well, this is probably the best way to explain it. The proud heart of the king of the south that conquered and carried away the Syrian army to the extent that tens of thousands will fall. In other words, it was a bloody conflict. That's the best way to put it. The heart of Ptolemy IV was proudly satisfied, but the advantage gained was soon lost. Yet he will not prevail, this verse says. Even though he has this powerful winning combination over the north, it won't last long. And we ask the question why, and verse 13 begins to explain it. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Sounds like somebody has regathered his feet underneath him and he is ready to go back to battle. And we need to see these things as to and fro and to and fro and to and fro. Keep in mind, secular history validates everything that's said here. Well, verse 13, because Antiochus III would again raise a greater army than before, enabling him to press on unto the unfinished war against the south, with a great army and much equipment, it says. We notice how this was accomplished in verse 14 as we read, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. A very interesting insert. This time Antiochus III had a Confederate army as he gathered himself together to go back and whip the South. And he joined with Philip V of Macedon, which is where?
Greece.
North of Greece. And also with the Jewish recruits. Now, these recruits are called the violent ones among your people. This is a Jewish contingent that joins him in the newly reestablished beginnings of Judah after they have been sent back by Persian king to reestablish their kingdom under the rule of God. That country having been totally decimated, is now being rejuvenated. And so as they come back, some of them get a proud mind. And they join in with the king of the north and the Syrian king Antiochus III, and they join to go south against the king of the south. But they go with the attitude to fulfill the vision that God had given them, that they could go back and reestablish their nation and be proud about it and be in line with God so that he wouldn't curse them again. They had a vision of what had been received from Ezekiel and Daniel and Jeremiah, the prophets that lived in those days. And they went back and they joined under their own power. This Jewish vision, it's Judah's vision. It's not Ephraim's vision because the 10 tribes are still not part of this. This is just the 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah that had been in Babylon, that had been restored back into their land by the king of Persia, Cyrus. So the Jewish vision, which is Judah's vision, was short-sighted, for God's blessing would not free Israel by means of man's thoughts or works or his confederacy. Daniel states in this verse, though they lift themselves in their pride, if I may insert, they will fall down. So this Jewish confederacy with the king of the north goes in the anticipation of the promises of God, foreseeing that they would be indeed empowered, as it were, to destroy their enemies. God would bless them. But God wasn't in this. This was a false aspiration of some of the people that had returned to Judah. Interesting, isn't it? So verse 15 goes on and tells us, then the king of the north will come and cast up a siege mound and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. So we can see the power of the north coming back, as it were, to overpower the south. But where do they attack first that we are told here? Well, it's this time that again it's Antiochus III in the north with his Confederate army, joining with Philip of Macedon and with the Jewish recruits of Israel. And he comes up and lays siege to a well-fortified city. That city is called Sidon. Where's Sidon? Just on the southern side of Syria, on the northeastern side of Israel. Okay, so he's coming down. Keep in mind that the pathways of that day were already well established between Egypt and the nations to the north by the Via Maris, the way by the sea. Okay, so it follows the coastline down, and these city-states that have been established, the Phoenicians in Tyre and Sidon to the north, were not conquered until the Greeks literally made a causeway and destroyed it. But the Sidon portion of the land, not out on Tyre here, but at Sidon, is said to be, at this point in time, the first place to fall. And so he laid a siege against Sidon, defeated the forces of the south, ruled by Ptolemy V. You notice that we're marching down the king line in terms of time. Ptolemy V Epiphanes of Egypt. This is 203 BC. The south was thereby conquered, unable to stand against the north. It says, quotes in quotes, there will be no strength to make a stand. The siege mounds were laid against the cities of the south, and they couldn't withstand it. Okay, so in verse 16, but he who comes against him, Antiochus III, will do as he pleases. So Antiochus has got control. And no one will be able to withstand him. No one able to withstand him. Read that. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. What is being said here? Should Antiochus III be confronted with any other power, he will overcome them. That's the first thing. He's got enough power to whip anybody who comes in his face. His established power was centered in the beautiful land, and we understand that from the studies of the original language to be the Philistine lands of Israel, along the Via Maris. He's come from Sidon. Where is he going to come? He's going to come right down the Via Maris and right down through those places that we know, at the tip of which is Gaza leading into Egypt. Right? And so that's where we're at here. And he comes as an alien king with the power to destroy and a will to do so against any in the south. Verse 17. And he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace which he will put into effect. He will give him, Ptolemy V, the daughter of women to ruin it. But she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Oh, how do you get through that? Well, let's see if we can. This is kind of a prologue thought. As had been before, the South was again arising as a future threat. So Antiochus parlayed a treaty. Here comes the treaty business again. He's already gone in and he's pretty well conquered everything, but you know, the one conquered doesn't always sit quietly, and it's beginning to rise up again. And so he begins to parlay a treaty, a proposal of peace, it says in quotes. Sealed, if he could, by a marriage, giving Ptolemy V of Egypt his daughter, that is Antiochus III, not the fourth, Antiochus is a third daughter. That daughter is said to be Cleopatra. She was 7 years old. Now, when you give a 7-year-old as a wife of an opposing king, she's being raised as a child. She doesn't know much about her former life. She's too young to understand it all. And she grows up being very Egyptian. Okay, got that in mind? So this guy says, quotes, ruined the treaty, for the young girl acculturated in Egypt took a stand against her corrupt father in the north and sided with the Egyptian monarchs. You got it? Maybe Antiochus III thought he had bought off Egypt, as he was obsessed with expansionist thoughts, using the power of his whole kingdom, it says. Sealed as if by an insurance policy, by the gift of his young daughter to the other king. He thought, got it made. I'll quiet the angst of of the king of the south who's beginning to raise his head up again. I'm just going to quiet that, and I'm going to give him my daughter. His daughter turns about, grows up in the land of Egypt, and becomes an enemy of the north. Didn't work. Didn't work at all. So in verse 18 we read, "Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn." Now you've got to understand that history explains some of this, as it's already been played out. And this is the way it reads in the scriptures that we are given. "Forthwith the angel said, he will turn his face," quotes and quotes, "to the west." That is, to the coastlands. Antiochus turns his face toward the coastlands. He deviates from what's going on in the south. He's made a treaty with his daughter down there, and he turns his face toward the coastlands of Greece and Asia Minor. So we're talking across the Mediterranean. This was in 197 to 192 BC, with pleasing success until a commander. Now the commander is defined in history as Cornelius Scipio from the fledgling Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is beginning to rise. Does not Cleopatra get involved with the Caesars? Well, anyway, so this commander who's beginning to take over the provinces of once powerful Greece and moving into Asia Minor and taking over what we call the rise of the Roman Empire that you remember was seen by Nebuchadnezzar as the legs and feet of iron, is arising. And so Cornelius Scipio defeated Antiochus. Indeed, Antiochus III had scorned or taunted Rome, and it did not pay off. Cornelius was more powerful. The Romans were getting much more powerful. So in verse 19, "So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more." Returning back home to Syria, his pride turned him to the east. History shows that he went toward Persia, but there he met his end. It says here in quotes, "He will stumble and fall and be found no more." This was in 187 BC that Antiochus III disappeared from history. Now we should note in the context of Antiochus III and his dreams was the reestablishment of Alexander's empire. He turned his face when he was whipped in the west, and in the south he had been theoretically placated for a while. He turned his face toward the east. He's got expansionist dreams. He's moving everywhere he can stick his nose to find a place where he can conquer somebody. The Romans had shut him off in the west. That which was brewing in the south would soon get to him too if it had lasted long enough. But he, in his scorn against Rome, he had to turn his back and go back home. And he didn't stop there, he just went on east. And that's where he met his end. Okay? And that's the end of Antiochus III. So, in the context of Antiochus III's dreams was this reestablishment of Alexander's empire. And we also must mention that the failed treaty with Egypt through marriage in verse 17 led the south to again defeat the north in 217 BC, capturing some of Syria's southern lands. So verse 20, "Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though neither in anger nor in battle." A snippet of time. Next in line to Antiochus III was Seleucus IV. The angel said he would oppress through taxation. What is going on here is that Rome required Syria to pay tax. And Syria says, well, we can't raise enough money, so we're going to tax Jerusalem and add it to what we owe to Rome. And that's what's going on. So the angel said he would oppress through taxation upon Jerusalem. The original language tells us that this is a taxation that has to do with Jerusalem and its temple taxes being ferreted out, stolen, as if you would please. This is the first time the kingdoms of the north are beginning to really exert power in Israel and upon Israel. They've been going to and fro in their war, but leaving Israel pretty much untouched. Even some of Israel had joined in with Antiochus III just recently and helped. But now the Seleucus, he's in straits. He's taken over because Antiochus III is gone, and he's taken over, and he doesn't have enough money to pay Rome. So he taxes, he oppresses by taxation Israel, or Judah, if you please. But his reign was brief, it reads in this verse, for, quotes, he will be shattered, though neither in anger or battle. How does that happen? Well, history said he was assassinated by poisoning. So his life was cut short, and his reign was very short-lived. Now we get into the meat of trouble. All of this is history. What's to come is going to become history as we read on. And then we'll get into history that is not yet here as we finish up the end of the chapter and move into chapter 12. But in verse 21, we read these words. And in his place, a despicable person. Nice way to talk. A despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Seleucus is to be replaced by a despicable person. He's been poisoned, he's dead, he was the appointed king. Everything's kind of quiet, but there's no king that's been appointed yet to replace him. This despicable person is a son of Antiochus III also, another son who scorns God, as will the Antichrist in the far future. The two of them become now the type and the antitype. And we begin to work on that again. And Daniel's going to get an earful. He thought he had heard all he could tolerate. He hasn't begun to hear it all. He was not honorably made a king, but he will seize the vacated throne, the kingdom by intrigue. Hebrew word means flattery and hypocrisy. Sounds like our elections. We know him as Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who rules from 175 to 163 BC. He's infamous in scriptural understanding. He is the little horn of Daniel in Daniel 8, who foreshadows the little horn of Daniel 7:8, known as the Antichrist. He is the type that foreshadows what is the ultimate end. He is like unto the ultimate end guy, the Antichrist. Here in chapter 11, verses 21 to 35, his reign is described in length and detail. Epiphanes means illustrious one, but because of his vileness and unworthiness, he was given the name and has hung on him for a long time, Epimanes, which in translation means the madman. He was known as the madman. Hitler-esque, if I please to say. In verse 22, and the overflowing forces, this is the king of the south that is now arisen, will be flooded away before him. Even though the south comes up again to smack at the north is going to run over them. The overflowing forces, the king of the south, will be flooded away before him, and the shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. The prince of the covenant is the high priest in the temple. So, looking at verse 22, it's kind of a prologue of a recurring theme about this vile king. The king of the south would try to overflow, it says, Antiochus IV. But he was in turn flooded away in defeat. It's kind of a play on words, is it not? History says Antiochus IV was stopped just short of Alexandria, Egypt, in his war of retaliation against the south. The taxation by the oppressor of Seleucus IV that came in verse 20 is now consummated by Antiochus IV when he replaced the high priest. So here comes Antiochus IV, and he replaces, taxation's already been started. Now he's beginning, as evil always evolves, to do something more evil, and he begins to replace the high priest in the temple. And he replaces with Osias III, who was there as the priest, with his brother Jason. And this was done apparently by a moneyed auction. So they were selecting priests by the power of Antiochus in control of it through a moneyed auction, not by the genealogy of God's demand. Sounds kind of bought off, doesn't it? Oh, it sounds a little bit like today in our government. Bought off. And again, repeated 4 years later when Menelaus was appointed high priest, apparently by a moneyed auction, replacing Jason. Verses 23 and 24, I'm going to begin to combine some verses now. And after the alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. And he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. The alliance apparently we're talking about is that alliance that was made between North and South, questionably Ptolemy V. I'm not clear in my mind right now about that. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. So Antiochus IV is in picture here as we look. Deception is the name of his game. He is a vile king. He is a deceiver. He is a madman. By a feigned alliance with the South, Scripture reveals that Antiochus practiced deception, quotes in quotes, verse 23, to gain advantage and power, quotes, in a time of tranquility, verse 24, enabling him to steal the wealth of Egypt. In fact, he didn't have to use a whole lot of people to do it. When you use deception, you don't always have to bring your biggest battle army against it. So somehow he's able to plunder booty and possessions, verse 24, to consolidate favor for only a time. There was some kind of an agreement here that allowed it to be somewhat tranquil as he took away the wealth of Greece. Now, what did he do with that wealth? He distributed that wealth among the Jews with his great program of equity. Sounds familiar to the Antichrist in his first 3.5 years. Also, I might add, and I have to add, all earthly socialist governments empowers equity. Socialism didn't start in our day. It's been going on from this day and before. It's the nature of secular government to use deception through the power of socialism, which wipes out middle classes, makes slaves of the lower class, and gives great wealth to the upper class. But is always anti-Semitic. Every one of them are anti-Semitic. If you don't think that was not in God's plan, I don't know how else you rationalize it. Well, enough of that. That got off on a twig on a tree. But as we look at verses 25 to 27 in closing this morning, we read these words. And he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. 2 big armies getting ready. But he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. And those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. There's a lot here to be digested. Deception is continuing here, and its outcome is revealed. Antiochus IV was emboldened to go against the king of the south, now with a larger army, it says. The king of the south saw it coming and likewise prepared. In the battle of 170 BC, the south lost again by schemes devised against him. His own advisors were against him. Schemes came from his own advisors, verse 25. Ptolemy VI's advisors were those who eat his choice food. Who eats the choice food of a king? His close advisors. They will also be those who destroy him. Shadow governments? They're not new. We've just come through one. These were, quotes, schemes devised against him, verse 25, that led to the Egyptian army being, quotes, swept away, with many slain. In verse 27, both kings were liars and deceivers, quotes, with hearts intent on evil. Even when face to face in amicable disguise, hypocrisy Can't always see the hypocritical heart because the face doesn't look that way. The angel prophetically said, quotes, "It will not succeed," verse 27, "for God has," quotes, "appointed an end to this ongoing deception at the appointed time." God is mixing this pot, and it's stewing with bad, evil odors. We're going to find out just how that works as we study ahead, and how indeed anti-Semitism rises to the top of this stinky pot that's being stewed. Do you find this interesting? I hope it isn't too boring. Because if you sit down and read Daniel 11 without any forethought or understanding, and with no secular history behind it to embolden you to believe everything that's being said and how it came about, you're kind of left bored. And I'm afraid that most of the Church of God is bored. They're bored with prophecy. Of all the books that have been written, I think it's been reported that only about 2 substantial books on prophecy have been published out of 800 other books. The church is not interested in prophecy. We're living in prophetical times. If we don't understand the prophecies that God gave us and told Daniel to heed, woe unto us. For at least almost a third of all Scripture is prophetical. It proves that what God says, He means. It proves that He is, I am. And only a fool who says he knows God is going to turn his back on prophecy. Let's stand for a closing word of prayer. Lord, you blessed us with your word again, and understanding of Daniel 11, O Lord, give it unto us this day. Our portion to understand, but most of all to understand that you are indeed the God of history. It is your story. And it's confirmed in this event of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids that leads to Antiochus IV, who indeed is the type of the Antichrist to come. Father, may we understand it as best you want us to understand it, and live by faith unto the calling of it, so that we, O Lord, can understand that your intent is to bring your church away from the time of wrath, take us home. And we can pray for that this day with the assurity of your promise, as we do it in Jesus' name. Amen.